Hey friends, tonight, let's explore why medieval people didn't just fear wolves. They admired them a lot, sometimes to the point of slightly weird hero worship. You're lying on a scratchy straw mattress in a wooden hut somewhere on the edge of a forest. It's nighttime, of course, because that's when the stories get good. Outside, the wind murmurs through the trees, but underneath it, low and distant, you hear it. A howl. Long, mournful, and somehow proud. You pull the blanket tighter. It smells like sheep and regret. But you don't feel scared. You feel something else. That noise doesn't sound like a threat. It sounds like a song, one that no human throat could ever master, but every human heart might understand. In many parts of medieval Europe, especially in the more forested and mountainous regions, wolves weren't just seen as pests or predators. They were emblems of freedom, of strength, of stubborn, wild courage. Imagine this. You're a farmer scraping out a life on frost-bitten land. Your boots frozen, your neighbors suspicious, your taxes unreasonable. And yet somewhere out there, there's a creature that answers to no one, doesn't bow to kings, doesn't pay tithes, doesn't even care if your chimney smokes wrong on Sundays. It howls when it wants, hunts where it pleases, survives. You can see why people started carving wolves onto their doorposts or weaving them into family crests. Not because they thought wolves were cute, but because they respected what they represented. And then there's the tale of the Grey One of Les Landes, a popular ballad in the 12th century told by traveling minstrels who, let's be honest, were basically the medieval internet. The story tells of a lone wolf who saves a village by attacking a group of bandits hiding in the woods. The villagers naturally react with suspicion. They trap it, cage it, and plan to kill it. But on the night before the execution, the bandits return, and the wolf, still in its wooden cage, begins howling. Loud, long, relentless. The village wakes up. The alarm is sounded. The bandits are caught, and the wolf released with an apology, given a roast chicken. Then it vanishes into the trees and never comes back. Moral of the story: sometimes your savior has sharp teeth and zero interest in thank you notes. What's interesting is that this admiration for wolves wasn't always universal or constant. The church, for instance, had a more conflicted stance. Wolves were sometimes associated with sin, chaos, or even the devil. But then again, everything fun was associated with sin, chaos, or the devil. Dancing sin, wine chaos, left-handedness Satan. Yet local traditions refused to let go. In Slavic regions, there were entire rituals performed during full moons where villagers would mimic wolf howls to summon courage before hunts. They called it singing with the pack. Scholars argue over whether these were religious rites, folk magic, or just cold peasants trying to feel something on a Tuesday night. But perhaps the most curious part is this wolf howls were considered in some areas to be protective. People would say that if you heard a lone howl to the east, it meant your household would be safe from bandits for 7 nights. But a howl to the west, that was a warning. The land was restless. You were advised to lock your gates. Or if you were rich enough to own one lock your goat, you shift on the mattress. The wood under your back creaks. Maybe it's just the wind. Or maybe the forest is still full of things older than laws and louder than reason. Tonight's historical fact. In medieval heraldry and local folklore, wolves often symbolized valor, guardianship, and resistance to tyranny, especially in regions where centralized authority was weak and the wilderness reigned. And the quirky detail: In certain mountain villages, children were taught to howl, not cry, when scared. It was believed the forest would protect a voice that matched its own. And here's a debate for the scholars. Were wolves respected because of their actual behavior, or did medieval people project onto them a kind of rebellious ideal they themselves couldn't live out? Were wolves noble or just convenient metaphors for frustrated farmers? Either way, the howl still lingers in the air. And somewhere not far from your dreams, something wild is listening back. Oh, and by the way, if you've ever tried howling at the moon yourself, no judgment. The acoustics in the bathroom are surprisingly flattering. Also, fun fact, wolves don't actually howl at the moon. They just happen to be dramatically backlit, like singers who found the perfect spotlight by accident. And if someone ever tells you a lone wolf is sad, just remind them maybe it's not lonely. Maybe it just needed some space from group projects. Wolf nights and other oddities. You wake up, or maybe you never really fell asleep and you're somewhere else now. Not in a forest hut, but in a cold stone hall that echoes with every clink of armor and creak of wood. Torches flicker along the walls, smoke curling up, like it's trying to escape the room before the political conversation starts. You're sitting at the edge of a long wooden bench, surrounded by knights. And not just any knights. These ones have wolves painted across their shields. Wolves etched into their breastplates. Wolves embroidered in thread so silver it catches the torchlight like teeth. Welcome to the Order of the Wolf. Or at least one of many. Turns out knights in the Middle Ages loved naming their little groups. And they really, really loved wolves. Historically, there was the Order of the White Wolf in France, established in the 14th century. It wasn't around long, only a few years. But while it lasted, its members wore emblems featuring snarling white wolves and claimed to be defenders of both church and wildlands. Some scholars say they were created to fight off robbers and mercenaries during a time of general chaos. Others argue they were mostly an excuse for minor nobles to show off matching cloaks and talk dramatically in Latin. Either way, these knights weren't alone in their furry fandom. Across medieval Europe, countless knightly orders, mercenary bands, and noble families adopted the image of the wolf. It symbolized bravery, loyalty, and cunning in battle. Unlike lions, which roared nobly, but didn't actually live in Europe, wolves were real. You could hear them outside the walls. You could become them in spirit. Some knights even mimicked wolf behavior in combat, howling before charges using fast flanking maneuvers and choosing gray-toned armor. Imagine being an enemy soldier, and suddenly the woods erupt with armored men howling and sprinting at you like wolf cosplay got out of hand. But the symbolism didn't stop there. In certain knightly initiation rituals, especially in Slavic regions, young squires were expected to spend a night alone in the forest, listening for wolves, not to fight them, just to hear them, to be reminded that courage isn't about winning. It's about knowing fear and still walking deeper into the woods. One story, half folktale and half footnote, tells of a knight in Bohemia who swore an oath never to retreat from battle unless he heard a wolf call 3 times. Supposedly, he once stood alone on a hill while others fled, insisting the third howl hadn't come yet. He survived. Barely. The story doesn't mention whether the wolf was real or just really late. In contrast, there were also less noble examples. A few knights used wolf iconography because it frightened peasants. A snarling beast on your tabard sent a message, "Don't mess with me, I bite." That, and the occasional unpaid bakery bill. So were these wolves symbols of heroism or intimidation? Depends on who was telling the story. To the common folk, they were a bit of both. If a knight came galloping in, wearing a wolf-headed helm, you didn't wait to check his alignment, you hid the chickens. Tonight's historical fact: medieval knightly orders often adopted animals as emblems of identity, and the wolf was among the most admired, viewed as a powerful, loyal, and wild creature that commanded fear and respect. Quirky detail of the evening: one surviving 13th century manuscript shows a knight riding not a horse, but a giant wolf. It's probably symbolic. Or maybe someone got really tired of drawing hooves. And your academic argument. Some historians argue that knights chose the wolf as a way of reclaiming their own independence in an increasingly rigid feudal world. Others say it was just branding medieval marketing with teeth. You shift in your seat. A knight beside you leans over and grins. He's missing 3 teeth. Probably still more pleasant than a group chat. Before the scene fades, someone lifts a drinking horn and howls, not a perfect note, but sincere. The others follow. For a moment, it's less like a council of war and more like a pack reunion. Loud, ridiculous, and somehow comforting. Just don't try this at your next office meeting. Also, if you ever find yourself needing to feel brave, wear gray walk with purpose, and if someone questions you, just growl softly and say you're part of an ancient order. Most people won't argue with that, especially if you mention cloaks. Monastery and the Midnight Prowler. You're inside a monastery now. It's late past curfew, past prayers, past the point where any reasonable candle is still burning. The stone corridor smells faintly of beeswax parchment and old secrets. Your footsteps are muffled by woven rush mats, and somewhere beyond the walls, a nightbird sings like it's auditioning for a sad ballad. And then you hear it. Not a hymn. Not the chant of weary monks. But something soft. Low. A scratch at the door. A rustle in the courtyard. And then a snort. A huff. The unmistakable sound of a creature very much alive and slightly annoyed by a locked gate. Welcome to the tale of the cheese-thieving wolf. This isn't legend. This is documented in the abbey records of a small monastic community in the foothills of the Pyrenees. Sometime in the late 1200s, the brothers began noticing an odd pattern. Every few nights, the wheel of cheese left to cool near the outer kitchen wall would vanish. Completely. No crumbs, no claw marks, just absence and a faint paw print trail in the dew. At first, suspicion fell on a wayward novice, then a rogue fox, then possibly divine intervention, because medieval monks had a wide range of explanations between it's the cook and it's a demon. Eventually, one monk took it upon himself to stay up through the compline hours and watch. What he saw became the stuff of whispered legend. A large gray wolf, thin but proud, padding silently into the yard, lifting the cheese delicately in its jaws and vanishing into the woods without so much as knocking over a pot. Not once, not twice, but regularly. Instead of setting traps, the monks did something very monk-like. They accepted it. One elder wrote, "If God wills that this creature seeks nourishment from our table, who are we to deny his will in furred form?" Which sounds noble, but may also be translated as, we're not going outside at night to argue with a wolf. Over time, the wolf earned a nickname, Frater Lupus, Brother Wolf. Some of the younger brothers even claimed that if you left a scrap of bread near the garden gate, you'd hear a gentle thump in the night and find the offering gone by dawn. And no chickens missing, as if the wolf understood hospitality. Now, we don't know if Frater Lupus was one wolf or a series of opportunistic forest residents. What we do know is this records show a lull in wolf attacks in that region during those years. Whether coincidence or cause, the monks began referring to the animal not as a pest, but a guest. You peer out a small stained glass window. There's frost on the ledge, and just beyond moonlight glints off a moving shape, four-legged graceful, pausing briefly before it disappears behind the chapel wall. In that pause, you feel it again. That strange calm. That recognition. That sense that not everything wild is a threat. Some things simply want cheese and to be left alone. Tonight's historical fact. While wolves were often feared and hunted, there are records, especially in isolated religious communities, of wolves being tolerated, even named when they posed no harm, and seemed to operate with eerie consistency. And your curious footnote, a monastery in northern Italy reportedly left offerings to a local wolf during a plague year, hoping the spirit of the forest would keep illness from their walls. Was it superstition or strategy? Well, the monastery survived. And now, the debate were these wolves truly peaceful cohabitants, or did the monks simply project a sense of divine order onto whatever behaved differently from the expected? Was the wolf trained intelligent or just hungry and lucky? You step away from the window. The candle on the desk burns lower, throwing shadows that look a little too much like fur. And behind you, the wooden floor creaks, not because anything's there, but because your mind just filled the silence. Let's be honest, even in the most peaceful places, the night has teeth. But sometimes it's also polite enough to knock first. And sometimes all it wants is dairy. Also, just a thought, if your midnight snack ever disappears from the fridge and you live alone, maybe you're not haunted. Maybe you're just part of an ancient cheese-based tradition. And if you hear someone howling outside at 2 a.m., maybe don't judge. They could be singing with the cloaked monks of the forest. Or maybe they just burned the lasagna again. Banner of the Northwind Pack. The wind is sharp tonight. Not bitter, just brisk, like it's trying to move things along before someone asks it to stay for supper. You're standing at the edge of a high ridge boots, planted in soft moss, watching the fabric of a flag dance like it's practicing for something dramatic. And on that flag, a wolf, silver, snarling, crowned. You've arrived at the border outpost of the Northwind Pack. No, not an actual pack of wolves. Well, not entirely. This was a noble house from a northern province near the edge of what was once the Holy Roman Empire. Their sigil, a crowned wolf's head, jaws open-tongue lolling like it just finished both a battle and a particularly smug joke. The Northwind family were minor nobles, which in medieval terms meant they had land titles and very little actual power unless they made enough noise to be noticed. Their solution, branding, medieval style. While other families went for lions, dragons, or theological symbols, the Northwinds leaned fully into the wolf. They put it on everything: shields, wax seals, saddlecloths, even the handles of their soup spoons. Every knight under their banner had to wear a fur-lined cloak, and their castle guards were known for howling before the changing of the watch. Subtle, not remotely. Memorable, absolutely. The family claimed their lineage descended from a child raised by wolves. A girl, to be precise, found in the woods during a hunt and adopted by the Baron's great-grandfather. Some say she never quite lost her edge, refused to sleep indoors, growled when upset, and once bit a tax collector. This apparently was all very romantic. Generations later, the Northwind heirs leaned into that mythology with the dedication of a brand strategist and the flair of a playwright with too much budget. One Baron Tommen the Grey commissioned a full mural depicting a line of wolves kneeling before a throne. Critics called it blasphemy. He called it ancestral memory. And yes, there were critics. The church was never thrilled about animals being elevated to near-human reverence, especially when said animals were prone to eating people's sheep. But the locals loved it. Farmers believed the Northwind lands had fewer wolf attacks. Whether this was due to actual wolves or clever gamekeepers is unknown. What's certain is that stories grew like moss on a damp wall. One popular tale tells of a rival lord trying to seize a Northwind outpost in winter. His men breach the walls only to flee minutes later pale and breathless, not from soldiers, but from the chilling sound of howls echoing from inside the keep, dozens of them rising in unison like a forest opera. No wolves were ever found, just well-trained guards with excellent timing and a flair for theatrics. Tonight's historical fact. In some noble families, animal symbolism wasn't just decorative, it was central to their identity, land policy, and public image. Wolves, despite their dangerous reputation, were adopted by certain houses as emblems of wild wisdom, ferocity, and independence. Odd historical tidbit. The Northwind family reportedly held an annual feast of the first howl, where nobles competed in howling contests under the full moon. The winner got a silver cup, a roasted boar, and the eternal embarrassment of any servants within earshot. And here's your debate point for the candlelit philosophy table. Did families like the Northwinds truly respect the wolf for its traits, or did they simply use the image to justify their own aggression and autonomy? Were they honoring nature or marketing rebellion with fur? You look up at the banner again. It flaps with a crack that sounds suspiciously like a bark. Or maybe that's just the wind nudging you to move along. Either way, it's a reminder that in medieval times, courage wasn't always measured by battlefield success. Sometimes it was in the stories you told about yourself and the animals you chose to howl for you. Also, for the record, there are no surviving instructions for the proper form of noble howling. But we can assume it was somewhere between dignified opera and mild throat irritation. And if your family ever complains that your last name doesn't mean anything, just tell them you've decided to revive the House of You with a new banner, a dramatic motto, and a ceremonial howl on the front lawn. If the neighbors complain, you're simply honoring tradition. Wolf tracks in royal bloodlines. You're in a dimly lit hall where portraits hang like quiet accusations. Faces of nobles long gone, some smug, some suspiciously identical, all slightly in need of better lighting. You walk slowly, eyes trailing, from one elaborate gold frame to the next, until you find it a man with a fur-lined cloak, a narrow face, and eyes that seem too sharp to be entirely human. Below the painting, a plaque reads, Lord Edric of Wormfield, Blood of the Wolf. Yes, that was the thing. Among medieval nobility, claiming descent from mythical beasts wasn't just acceptable, it was fashionable. But while many traced their line to dragons' demigods or suspiciously fertile saints, a few houses leaned hard into wolf ancestry. And when we say wolf, we don't mean a metaphorical spirit animal. No, we mean literal tales of someone's great-great-great-grandmother being blessed by a forest spirit in wolf form, or in one particularly odd chronicle, rescued by a pack of wolves, and then mysteriously returning with better reflexes and a dislike for silver. The House of Wormfield, for instance, kept detailed records claiming their lineage originated with a woman who suckled from a she-wolf after being abandoned in the wild. Centuries later, their heirs were said to be born with eyes like stormlight and the tempers of thunder. Translation: they scowled impressively and were terrible at dinner parties. Was it true? Almost certainly not. But did people believe it enough to get out of their way in dark hallways? Yes. Across Europe, stories like this popped up wherever local nobility wanted to distance themselves from the rabble or justify their occasionally questionable decisions. After all, if your blood runs wild, then surely it's not your fault when you bark at council meetings. The wolf blood claim wasn't always metaphorical either. Some families used it as explanation for medical oddities, hypertrichosis. A condition causing excessive hair growth was sometimes described as the wolf mark, and in a few court records, individuals with it were referred to as God's wildborn. Whether feared, revered, or locked in towers depended on the day and the mood of the local bishop. One tale, possibly apocryphal, but very well documented in Marginalia, which is the medieval version of I Swear This Happened, tells of a noble child born with patches of gray hair and startling blue eyes. His family declared it a blessing. The servants declared it a problem. The dog declared it competition. He grew up known as Young Fang, led his own troop into battle at 17, and reportedly bit a rival envoy on the wrist during negotiations. His family declared it diplomacy. Let's pause here for tonight's historical fact. In medieval, noble culture, lineage was everything, and invoking animal ancestry, especially wolves, was one way to appear powerful, untamed, and chosen by nature itself. These stories often blurred the line between myth and marketing. Curious side note: a few noble families were buried with wolf pelts wrapped around their feet, a tradition meant to ensure they'd walk wild into the afterlife. Some even had tombstones with paw prints carved beside their names. And the debate of the night: were these bloodline claims just convenient myth-making or genuine belief in a mystical connection to the animal world? Did these nobles truly feel a kinship with wolves? Or were they simply using fur and fangs to mask the same old hunger for power? You continue down the portrait hall, past another serious man in a wolfskin robe and one bored-looking lady with a fox draped across her lap, like a fashion statement that definitely required chasing. In the quiet, you almost expect to hear a low growl, but it's just the wind through the windows, or a courtier's stomach. Hard to say. And here's a gentle reminder: if someone ever tells you they have wolf energy, they might mean courage, or hunger, or a very specific Spotify playlist. Ask for clarification. Also, pro tip: if you ever get invited to a medieval-themed dinner and someone arrives in fur muttering about the old blood, just smile politely and maybe sit near the exit. A cure called Fang. You're standing in a dim stone chamber that smells like boiled herbs, damp straw, and just a hint of panic. Shelves line the walls crammed with clay jars labeled in handwriting that ranges from scholarly Latin to definitely written by someone mid-seizure. In the center, under a cracked glass dome, sits a single object, a wolf's tooth, tied to a faded ribbon. It's labeled Curatio Fortium, the cure of the brave. You're in a medieval apothecary, not the clean, polite kind you see in movies, but the real kind, where medicine and magic blend like soup and sediment, where people cured headaches with crushed emeralds and believed that powdered antler might improve your aim with a crossbow. In tonight's Star Remedy wolf parts, yes, that's right. In many corners of medieval Europe, Parts of wolves, especially their teeth, were believed to hold healing powers. Not just metaphorical protection either. We're talking prescriptions, sometimes issued by monks or physicians, for ailments ranging from fevers to faint-heartedness. Got night terrors? Tie a wolf fang to your wrist. Feeling cowardly in battle? Sew one into your tunic. Afraid of childbirth? Place a tooth under the mattress. Need protection from curses, ghosts, or the creeping melancholy that comes from living in a damp castle with 7 cousins named Ethelred? You guessed it, more wolf teeth. The logic, if we can call it that, was based on the theory of sympathetic magic. The idea that the traits of an animal could be transferred through contact. Wolves were fierce, fearless, tireless. People wanted those qualities, and lacking access to gyms or therapy, they turned to what nature offered: bits of predator. One 14th century French manual, De Natura Vivendi, describes a wolf-tooth amulet worn by soldiers to ensure firmness of foot and courage of chest. Which frankly sounds like a medieval gym slogan. Of course, acquiring these cures wasn't easy. Wolves were not exactly willing donors. So a secondary market emerged: traders who dealt in ethically sourced wolf teeth. Which probably means they waited until someone else did the dangerous part and then sold it at double the price in town square. You pick up the tooth. It's old, yellowed, and still has a bit of string wrapped around the root, as if someone wore it once, like a necklace or a warning. But here's where it gets stranger. Some physicians of the time actually wrote against the practice, claiming there was no proof of efficacy and that the belief bordered on paganism. In response, certain noble households doubled down. One even commissioned a family physician to write a treatise arguing that the body of the wolf was nature's instrument for bravery. He was paid handsomely and never seen battling anything more dangerous than indigestion. Even weirder, there's one recorded case of a woman who believed her husband's cowardice in battle came from removing his wolf fang amulet before a siege. She insisted on sewing a fresh one into his armor. He survived. The fang did not. Let's pause for tonight's historical fact. In medieval folk medicine, wolves were believed to embody courage, endurance, and spiritual protection. Their teeth and bones were used in amulets and remedies by both the poor and the powerful. Tonight's curious footnote: a few monasteries banned the sale of wolf fangs on holy days, citing confusion among the faithful. Apparently, people were mistaking magical bravery for divine intervention. And the academic debate: did these practices arise purely from folk tradition, or were they the result of deeper symbolic thinking, an attempt to channel the wildness humans had long suppressed in themselves? Were these cures about health or identity? You tuck the tooth back under its dome. The apothecary seems quieter now, as if something unseen is satisfied. Also, maybe a little proud. And here's a friendly note from history's awkward drawer. If you ever buy a necklace described as wolf tooth for confidence, maybe check if it's plastic. If not, you might be wearing the medieval equivalent of a personality booster shot. Also, if you've ever wondered why someone in the office is oddly bold during presentations, don't ask if they're wearing wolf bones. HR would definitely disapprove. Howling heraldry. You're strolling through a great hall lined with shields, dozens of them, each one polished, painted, and proudly displayed like a medieval version of a family Instagram profile. There's one with a lion roaring, another with a stag leaping. But the one that stops you cold mid-step, mid-breath is simple. A single wolf, mid-howl, painted in silver against a deep blue field. And suddenly, the room feels quieter. In the Middle Ages, heraldry was more than decoration. It was identity advertisement and low-key intimidation rolled into one. Every shape, color, and creature told a story. And if your story involved a wolf, that meant something. Wolves were a complicated choice in heraldry. Not as regal as a lion, not as pure as a swan, not as holy as a lamb. But the wolf didn't care. The wolf was strength in solitude, loyalty to the pack, and fierce protection of its own, which made it a perfect emblem for families who valued independence, or had a chip on their collective shoulder. Some coats of arms featured wolves walking, calm, intentional. These belonged to families who saw themselves as watchful, dignified, unflinching. Others depicted wolves in full snarl, often standing on two legs, because realism was less important than attitude. Those were usually the families you didn't want to owe rent to. And then there were the howling wolves. That posture wasn't just artistic flair. In heraldic language, a howling wolf called a wolf rampant in cry meant readiness, alertness, and defiance. It said, "I stand alone, but I will not be silent," which coincidentally also describes at least half the people who take karaoke very seriously. The oldest confirmed use of a howling wolf in heraldry comes from a 13th century family in what is now southern Germany. They were minor nobility with a small hill fort and an intense dislike for taxation. Their motto, clamo ergo sum. I howl, therefore I am. Nice. Of course not. Everyone was a fan. In some circles, a wolf on your shield marked you as a dangerous loner, possibly one step from outlaw or worse wizard. Church authorities occasionally raised eyebrows, particularly when a family with wolf heraldry got too cozy with pagan rituals involving bonfires, poetry, and large quantities of mead. Still, for every suspicious priest, there was a bard who loved the image. Songs were written about lone knights with wolf emblems, wandering into cursed forests, righting wrongs and disappearing before dawn. Sometimes they had glowing eyes. Sometimes they turned into actual wolves. And sometimes they just needed a nap and weren't very good at explaining themselves. Fun fact, the use of wolves in heraldry wasn't limited to Europe. In parts of the Islamic world and Central Asia, wolves appeared in banners and folk symbols as protectors of tribes, hunters, and guides. It seems the admiration for their strength crossed language, geography, and at least 4 species of questionable poetry. Back in your Hall of Shields, you notice something strange. A particular coat of arms with not one, but 3 howling wolves. Stacked vertically, each one looking in a different direction, past, present, and future. It's a design so unusual scholars still argue about its meaning. Was it a warning, a claim to foresight, or just an artist showing off? The answer, like many medieval things, is yes. Tonight's historical fact. In medieval heraldry, wolves represented vigilance, courage, and an untamed spirit. A howling wolf in particular symbolized voice refusing to go quietly, even when outnumbered or outmatched. Curious detail of the evening. One noble family commissioned a mechanical door knocker shaped like a howling wolf that let out a high-pitched whine every time someone knocked. It was decommissioned after 3 weeks due to nervous guests and at least one incident involving spilled soup. And the scholarly debate, was the howling wolf an act of bravery or desperation? Did it represent resilience or the cry of someone pushed too far? In heraldry, image is everything but interpretation. That's inherited like your great uncle's uncomfortable stories at family dinners. You move past the shields, they're painted wolves all frozen mid-call. Some noble, some feral. All staring into a history where silence was never an option. Also, if you ever want to make your family crest a little more interesting, May I suggest a tasteful wolf, perhaps mid-howl, perhaps wearing a tiny crown. Bonus points if it's holding a spoon. And remember, if someone ever calls you dramatic for expressing yourself loudly in public, just remind them it's not noise, it's heraldry. Tales told by firelight. The flames crackle softly. You're sitting on a low wooden bench in a roundhouse that smells like peat smoke wet wool and someone's attempt at roasting turnips. Children are huddled nearby, eyes wide cheeks, smudged with soot and soup. A dog snores by the door, twitching at something it probably regrets chasing. And in the center, an old woman leans close to the fire and begins to speak. Her voice is raspy, her words slow, but every syllable lands like it's been aged in oak. The tale, A Wolf in the Woods. Of course, because no medieval storytelling night was complete without at least one wolf, sometimes a villain, sometimes a guide, sometimes something much stranger. The wolf was everywhere in medieval folklore, not just in the forests, but in the fears, hopes, and bedtime routines of the people. And these weren't your neat, sanitized fairy tales. These were stories with dirt under their nails and strange morals, where the wolf wasn't always defeated, and sometimes it talked back. One popular tale in Eastern Europe featured a wandering knight who was guided through a cursed bog by a blind wolf. Blind but wise. The knight, of course, was skeptical until the wolf began quoting scripture in Latin. The story ends with the knight reaching his destination wiser and humbler, while the wolf fades into the mist, muttering something about how no one listens to the forest anymore. Another fireside favorite, The Wolf Bride of Glen Tuath. A woman disappears during a snowstorm. Her husband searches for her, only to find a pack of wolves surrounding a cloaked figure by a frozen stream. She turns to him, eyes gold smile toothy, and says, "I'm warmer here." He runs. The moral depends who's telling it. Some say it's a warning about losing your spouse to wildness. Others say it's a liberation anthem with better fur. And then there's the French tale of the village that stopped sacrificing goats to appease the wolves and instead offered songs. Every full moon, the villagers would gather on the hill and sing ballads. The wolves came. They sat. They listened. And they stopped eating livestock, temporarily, until someone hit a sour note and, well, there's a reason it became a cautionary tale for aspiring bards. What's fascinating is how often wolves were portrayed not just as monsters, but as almost human. Not quite. Never tame. But not dumb beasts either. In the stories, they understand bargains. They test people. They hold grudges. In one Middle English ballad, a widow invites a wolf into her home during a blizzard. It doesn't speak. It doesn't leave. It just sits by the fire day after day, growing thinner, older, until one night it disappears, and the widow finds a pouch of silver where it slept. Was it a cursed prince? A ghost? An allegory for loneliness? No one agrees, but every village had a version of that tale. Tonight's historical fact. In medieval European folklore, wolves were central figures in oral storytelling. They weren't just threats. They were mirrors, tricksters, punishers, teachers, often wiser than the humans they encountered. The quirky twist. Some rural areas actually banned wolf stories during certain seasons, believing that tales told in spring could wake the forest. Whether this was superstition or just a way to keep kids quiet during planting season is still debated. And the academic question, were these wolf tales meant to preserve knowledge about real dangers? Or did they serve as emotional release valves, ways to process grief isolation and change through the mouth of a predator? The fire pops, and someone shrieks, not from fear, but because an ember just landed on their boot. The old woman smiles. She hasn't even gotten to the part with the glowing eyes yet. And as you lean back, letting the rhythm of her tale wrap around you like a wool blanket, you realize something. Sometimes the scariest stories are the ones that sound just believable enough. Also, reminder, if someone tells you their grandmother once spoke to a wolf in a dream and received life advice, be respectful. Grandmothers have connections. And if you ever tell a story by firelight and someone rolls their eyes, just say it was passed down from the wolf side of the family. Then pause slowly and grin. The Wolf and the Warrior Monk. You're walking through a snow-covered courtyard at dawn. Your breath clouds in the air like lazy ghosts, and the stone beneath your feet crunches with every careful step. Up ahead, a monk is kneeling in the snow. His robe is threadbare, his boots are laughably thin, and beside him, still as a statue calm as an old truth, is a wolf, not a dog, not a metaphor, a real hulking gray-furred wolf, watching you with eyes the color of old pewter. This is not your average monastery. In the highlands of early medieval Ireland and parts of Wales, isolated religious communities often lived close to nature, closer than most of us today would be comfortable with. The wilderness wasn't just background decoration. It was part of their theology. Some even believed that the natural world carried echoes of divine order, including the parts with teeth. Which brings us to a real story. Somewhere between history and legend, there lived a monk warrior known as Brother Cormac, part hermit, part defender of his abbey, part man who would rather not explain his past. The chronicles describe him as silent, strong, and not particularly fond of rules, written by men who'd never chopped wood in their lives. One winter, during a period of raids and political upheaval, Brother Cormac was said to have disappeared into the forest for 7 days and nights. He returned with wounds, a ragged cloak, and a wolf. Just one. Large, calm, loyal. The other monks naturally panicked, but the abbot allowed the wolf to stay under the condition it didn't disrupt prayers or livestock. It did neither. The wolf followed Cormac everywhere, sat outside his cell at night, accompanied him during meditation, growled once at a bishop. No one blamed it. The stories vary after that. One account claims the wolf defended the abbey from raiders lunging from the shadows like a holy spirit with claws. Another insists the wolf helped Cormac track down a lost child in the forest. A third says it simply kept him warm at night. And perhaps that was enough. For years, visitors to the abbey recorded sightings of the monk and his beast, often with curiosity, sometimes with awe, and occasionally with the sort of side eyes that mean someone suspects low-level heresy. When the wolf eventually died peacefully, according to one account, it was buried in the abbey's graveyard. No tombstone, just a patch of earth beside the chapel wall and a line in the monastery's record companion to Cormac: faithful, fearless, fanged. Tonight's historical fact. While not common, there are documented cases of wolves being semi-domesticated by individuals in medieval times, particularly in isolated religious communities, where human-wildlife boundaries were blurred by mysticism and necessity. Quirky side note. Some monks believed that animals could be vessels of divine presence, or even angelic messengers in earthly form. One particularly enthusiastic scribe wrote that he'd rather trust the bark of a dog than the words of 3 bishops. And the scholarly debate: was Brother Cormac's wolf a real animal or a metaphor for spiritual strength? Did monks record the companionship because it was literal, or because it illustrated a deeper idea that peace with the wild was a form of divine grace? The snow continues to fall gently now. The monk rises from his prayer, nods at you silently, and turns to walk back toward the cloister. The wolf follows, matching his pace tail, low gaze forward. They don't look back. And maybe that's the lesson here. Some partnerships don't need explanation, just presence. Also, if you ever meet someone who names their pet brother Fang and keeps quoting Latin at the dog park, maybe don't dismiss them too quickly. History says they might be onto something. And if you're cold tonight, just imagine a furry, loyal companion curled at your feet, not asking for anything, not judging your bedtime snacks, just listening and keeping the dark a little further away. Wolves and winter parades. The snow is packed down under your feet, stamped flat by boot sleds and the occasional goat. You're in a village square where the air smells of roasted chestnuts, pine smoke, and a very suspicious kind of festive enthusiasm. Brightly dyed fabrics hang between beams, and small children run around in outfits that look like they were sewn in the dark by someone with strong opinions and no scissors. And then you hear the beat of drums, the clatter of hooves, and a sound you weren't expecting howling. A line of villagers rounds the corner, some on stilts, some banging pots, some wearing shaggy cloaks and snarling wooden masks carved to look like wolves, big wolves, slightly ridiculous wolves, but undeniably wolves. Welcome to the winter parade. Long before Instagram carousels or professional Santa impersonators, medieval Europe had its own strange version of seasonal celebration. And in certain regions, especially the colder, more isolated ones, winter festivals included wolves, not real ones. Usually, the tradition went by many names: La Marche du Loup, Wolf Run, Processione del Lupo. But the idea was simple during the darkest months, when the sun barely bothered to rise, and people worried more about spirits than taxes a communal parade would take place. People dressed as wolves to chase away evil, or to honor it, or to dance with it. Again, it depends on who you ask. In some alpine villages, boys would don wolf pelts, real ones if available, or cloth substitutes if the local fur supply was being stingy, and march through the streets, howling and stomping. This was supposed to frighten off the lingering winter demons, who, as everyone knew, had a deep fear of group theatrics and amateur percussion. But it wasn't just about scaring things away. There was symbolism, too. Wolves were survivors. They didn't hibernate, didn't beg, didn't freeze. They endured. So invoking the image of a wolf in winter was a way of saying, we see the cold, we acknowledge the dark, but like the wolf we persist. One particularly well-documented festival took place in what is now Western Austria. Villagers carved massive wooden wolf heads and wore them like helmets, stomping through snowdrifts in what must have looked like the world's most confusing theater troupe. At the end of the parade, they would circle a bonfire howl 3 times and throw sprigs of juniper into the flames to warm the spirit of the land, they said. Children were given small wooden wolf tokens to keep in their beds for protection. Sometimes they painted them. Sometimes they accidentally set them on fire. Either way, the sentiment was there. And here's a slightly weirder tradition. In a Welsh village near the coast, it's recorded that during one winter feast, the local blacksmith played the role of the great wolf. Covered head to toe in blackened sheepskin, he would enter the town hall and silently walk the perimeter of the feast before lying down by the fire. no one was allowed to speak until he rose. If someone giggled, they were made to bring firewood for the entire town for a week, which honestly sounds like excellent motivation for silence. Tonight's historical fact. Winter festivals in medieval Europe often featured animal symbolism, and in colder regions, the wolf appeared prominently not as a villain, but as a figure of resilience, protection, and community courage. Quirky little footnote. A noble family in Hungary was known for hosting wolf feasts every January, where guests were required to bring a fur or howl before being served soup. One guest allegedly lost their voice mid-howl and had to eat outside, with the actual dogs. And the scholarly debate. Were these festivals true folkloric traditions rooted in pre-Christian beliefs, or were they theatrical inventions to distract villagers from hunger and frostbite? Did people believe in the power of the wolf, or just need a reason to dress up and shout at the sky? The parade winds past you, now feet stomping cloaks, flapping someone tripping over a decorative log. A child offers you a carved token, its edges rough, but its meaning clear. You accept it. And as the howls rise into the icy air, you can't help but smile. Maybe they're warding off evil. Maybe they're celebrating survival. Or maybe they're just trying to feel warm and brave in a season that often feels long and lonely. Either way, you join in. Also, if you ever feel silly celebrating something small in the dead of winter, just remember your ancestors wore wolf masks, danced around fires, and took it very seriously. So go ahead and be weird. It's tradition. And if you're not ready to howl in public yet, no problem. Start with a low growl over your cocoa and see where it takes you. Scribes, scrolls, and snarls. You're deep inside a scriptorium, now a quiet stone room where candlelight flickers against shelves of vellum ink pots and the occasional inkwell that definitely wasn't cleaned in this century. Quills scratch like whispers in the dark. The air smells of old leather, damp wool, and ink so rich it probably counts as currency. And in the margin of one carefully illuminated page is a wolf. Not a scary wolf, not even a realistic one. This one is wearing glasses. Yes, glasses. Its front paw holds a scroll. Its mouth is open, as if reciting something very profound, or perhaps asking where the monk hid the snacks. Welcome to the strange world of medieval marginalia, where wolves didn't just prowl the forest, they prowled the page. In the high and late Middle Ages, scribes had long hours, sore backs, and access to exactly one form of entertainment, doodling. And when they doodled, their imaginations ran wild. You'd think the margins of ancient religious texts would be filled only with saints and angels. But no. Sometimes they're filled with werewolves giving lectures, wolves playing bagpipes, or tiny wolves riding snails into battle. Yes, really. Wolves in manuscripts served many purposes. Sometimes they were symbolic warnings against sin pride or straying from the flock. Other times, they were satire visual jokes, mocking corrupt priests or noble families. A few, honestly, just seemed like the artistic equivalent of, I haven't spoken to another human in 14 hours, and I'm going to draw a wolf doing yoga, and no one can stop me. One particularly famous manuscript, the Smithfield Decretals, features a wolf in monk's robes, standing at a pulpit, paws raised addressing a group of sheep. The caption, roughly translated, reads, "Beware the shepherd who wears fur beneath his wool. Subtle, not remotely. Effective, absolutely." But it wasn't just jokes. Some texts recorded serious stories of wolf sightings with religious implications. A 12th century English monk, claimed that a pair of wolves approached his abbey each winter. Solstice sat quietly in the courtyard for an hour and then vanished. He wrote, "Perhaps they are angels in borrowed coats." In other cases, scribes compiled tales of werewolves, not as horror stories, but as moral fables. One popular version involves a knight cursed to become a wolf by day, human by night. He becomes a better man, oddly, after several months of being a very polite and unnecessarily chivalrous wolf. And there were medical texts, too, claiming wolf saliva could heal wounds, wolf fat could cure stiff joints, and wolf breath, though rarely collected, was said to protect against madness. Please do not try to collect wolf breath. Medieval medicine was not FDA approved. Let's pause here. For tonight's historical fact, wolves appeared throughout medieval manuscripts, not only as threats or animals, but as complex symbols representing danger, knowledge, trickery, and sometimes divine presence in unexpected forms. Tonight's quirky detail. One scribe in northern Italy spent years illustrating an entire bestiary, only to fill the final page with a drawing of a wolf solemnly eating the book itself. Beneath it, he wrote, "May no one read past this point. The wolf disapproves." And the scholarly debate. Were these illustrations personal jokes, serious theological commentary, or coded criticism of authority? Some researchers believe wolves were a safe stand-in for criticizing church corruption or noble hypocrisy. Others argue they simply looked cool next to big capital letters. You reach out to gently touch the edge of a manuscript, and the painted wolf stares back mid-howl, mid-step, caught forever in the moment before it disappears off the edge of the page. Also, if you've ever doodled during a boring meeting and thought it had no value, take heart. You're part of a very old, very underappreciated scribal tradition. Bonus points if your doodle wears a tiny cape. And if you ever want to leave a lasting impression, add a wolf to the margins of your to-do list. Give it a monocle. Give it a sword. Let future archaeologists wonder what your priorities were. Trial of the Wolfman. You're seated on a splintery bench in a crowded stone hall that smells like damp wool, melted wax, and the sort of tension usually reserved for family dinners with unresolved inheritance issues. The crowd murmurs. A scribe dips his quill, and at the center of it all, chained barefoot and glaring, is the accused. He doesn't look particularly dangerous. Stringy beard, muddy ankles, cloak stitched from 5 different animals, none of them recently alive. But the charge is grim. He is accused of being a werewolf. Yes, a literal trial. Because in some corners of medieval Europe, especially during the 12th to 14th centuries, belief in lycanthropy wasn't just campfire gossip, it was something you could be formally prosecuted for. And if you think this sounds suspiciously like the world's first supernatural reality show, you're not far off. The case usually began with livestock disappearing. Then someone saw eyes in the woods. Then there was that one guy who always walked alone, muttered in Latin, and had suspiciously hairy knuckles. Suddenly, he's standing trial, while everyone who's ever heard him burp decides he might actually be cursed. The most famous of these trials took place in the Auvergne region of France, where a man named Pierre, nicknamed the Quiet One, was accused of lycanthropy. After several sheep vanished, and a child claimed to have seen him licking his lips under the full moon, Pierre reportedly said he was just eating a very good stew. No one believed him. The trial was long. Witnesses testified to things like smelling wolf breath and hearing growls near the well. The local priest insisted that Pierre's refusal to sing in Mass was a sure sign of inner beastliness. The man was eventually sentenced to penance exile, and somewhat dramatically, his nails were trimmed by clerics just in case transformation was triggered by talon length. Not all werewolf trials ended in exile. Some involved full-on executions, though these were often tied up with broader witchcraft accusations. If someone believed you consorted with wolves, there was a chance they also believed you consorted with darker things. Still, not everyone agreed with these verdicts. Certain scholars, like the German naturalist Albertus Magnus, argued that transformation into a wolf was metaphorical, a reflection of one's wild nature, not a biological switch. Others disagreed loudly, and probably with torches. In Scandinavian folklore, there were tales of Ulfadnar warriors who wore wolf pelts into battle and took on the beast's rage. These men weren't feared as monsters, but revered as elite fighters. So the line between cursed beast and brave warrior, extremely blurry. Tonight's historical fact. In medieval Europe, lycanthropy was considered a legitimate accusation, and formal trials were held for those suspected of shape-shifting, often blending superstition theology and folk justice in equal measure. Quirky twist. One 14th century trial transcript includes the accused interrupting the judge to say, "If I were a wolf, your robes would be missing by now." The scribe added in the margin, "Court was briefly adjourned for laughter and snacks." And the scholarly debate. Were these trials sincere expressions of belief or tools of social control, a way to punish outcasts, heretics, and anyone who didn't fit the mold? Were people genuinely afraid of wolves, or of what a wolf might symbolize within the human spirit? You glance again at the man in chains. He stares back, expression unreadable. Is he cursed, misunderstood, or just a guy with terrible posture and a taste for stew? The gavel well wooden spoon falls. The sentence is pronounced. The crowd exhales. And just before he's led away, the accused leans toward the guard and murmurs something. You don't hear what it is, but somewhere outside in the woods, just beyond the village walls, something howls. Also, next time you feel judged for wearing too many layers or skipping a group event, just remind yourself at least you weren't put on trial for being too furry under moonlight. And if anyone asks what that weird noise was last night, just say it was justice echoing through the trees. Or the wind. Definitely the wind. Wolves in wartime rhymes. You're crouched near a campfire that's doing its best to stay lit against the wind, its flames flinching with each gust like it's mildly offended. Around you, the ground is muddy, the tents sag, and the stew pot bubbles with something that might once have been a root vegetable. Maybe it's a war camp. Not the glamorous kind, just a muddled array of exhausted soldiers' cracked armor and that familiar smell of damp leather and unwashed optimism. But there's something else here too. Singing. Not grand hymns or bardic ballads. These are short, sharp rhymes, hummed under breath, scratched onto shield backs, passed from one cold pair of lips to another like a secret handshake between survivalists. And in these rhymes, there's always a wolf. Medieval soldiers often used animal metaphors in their marching chants, part mnemonic device, part morale, boost, part collective coping mechanism. Lions were kings. Eagles were messengers. But wolves were brothers. They were the ones you sang about when you needed to feel braver than you actually were. One of the most common refrains went something like, "Steel on my chest, mud on my shoes. We march like wolves, we die in twos." Charming. These rhymes weren't sung in courtly halls. They were battlefield poetry, raw, repetitive, designed to fit between trudging steps and anxious heartbeats. And they weren't just about valor. They were about loyalty. Wolves, after all, hunted in packs. They slept in piles. They circled their wounded. All things a medieval soldier, shivering in the dark, wanted to believe about his own lot. There are entire manuscripts often hidden in margins or slipped between pages of more noble texts that preserve these rhymes. Some were scribbled by scribes who had once served. Others were collected by curious monks who found them oddly beautiful, if a bit unpolished. One particularly haunting verse, translated from Old Occitan, reads, "When the moon is full and the battle near, sing not of kings, but of wolves you fear. For they do not falter, and they do not flee, and their names are lost like yours and me." Chills. And here's where it gets even more interesting. Some commanders leaned into this symbolism. One 14th century mercenary captain, known as Gerard the Grey, outfitted his men with fur-trimmed cloaks and had them howl before charges. His enemies thought it was barbaric. His troops thought it was bonding. His cook thought it was deeply unnecessary at breakfast. These howls weren't just noise. They were rhythm, rallying cry, psychological warfare with a furry soundtrack. And it worked at least until the wind changed and blew the sound straight into their own horses' ears. No strategy is perfect. Tonight's historical fact. Wolves were frequent figures in wartime songs and rhymes across medieval Europe, used to symbolize loyalty, courage, and shared fate among soldiers, particularly in low-ranking infantry, where myth mattered more than medals. Tonight's curious detail. One commander reportedly banned the singing of wolf rhymes before battle, fearing it summoned bad luck. His men complied, then just whispered the verses into their sleeves instead. They lost the next skirmish. The rhymes came back. So did morale. And the scholarly debate. Were wolf rhymes sincere expressions of solidarity, or were they simply useful tools of myth-making? Did they reflect actual beliefs in the animal's spiritual presence, or were they a gritty form of medieval self-branding, something to hold on to when steel met bone? The fire crackles. Someone nearby hums the tune again. You don't know the words yet, but you feel the rhythm. It's steady, stubborn, a little wild, and maybe that's the point. Also, if you ever find yourself singing in the shower to hype yourself up for the day, congrats. You're participating in a long and noble tradition of pre-battle rituals. Bonus points if your lyrics include wolves. And if someone asks what gets you through hard times, just say rhythm friendship and the occasional symbolic growl. Fur for the fearless. You're in a drafty stone chamber that smells like wet fur, burnt tallow, and pride. A young squire stands in front of a long wooden bench where several very tired-looking knights are seated. On the bench lies something unusual. Not a sword, not a scroll, but a cloak. Thick, gray, bristled like a storm cloud after a bad day. A wolf pelt. Tonight's honor isn't a new title or a shiny bit of metal. It's a gift of fur. The ceremonial donning of a wolf skin, granted only to those who'd proven themselves brave, or reckless enough to be mistaken for brave in the right lighting. Yes, in certain corners of medieval society, especially among warrior orders and northern frontier nobles, wolf fur wasn't just practical, it was symbolic. A statement piece, a medieval mic drop. Wearing a wolf pelt wasn't about staying warm, though it certainly helped in castles with a draft problem. It was about what the wolf meant. Resilience, savagery, when needed loyalty to kin, and the kind of courage that was less about speeches and more about surviving something that didn't want you to. According to several 13th century military accounts, wolf cloaks were bestowed after acts of particular valor, holding a bridge, alone saving a wounded comrade, or surviving a night in enemy territory with nothing but a dagger and a rude sense of humor. The cloaks served as both a reward and a warning. This one walks with the wolves now. Proceed with caution. In some noble households, the tradition went further. Sons were gifted their first wolf pelt at age 15, whether or not they'd earned it. It was meant to be aspirational, like handing someone a gym membership with the words, "No pressure, but your grandfather once fought a bear wearing this." And then there were the rituals. One small kingdom in the Baltic region hosted a Night of the Hoods, where warriors would gather in a circle, hoods down, cloaks on, and howl together before silently dispersing into the forest for a night-long watch. Supposedly, no one spoke a word until sunrise, which makes sense. Have you ever tried staying serious after group howling? Not easy. But not everyone approved. The church, as usual, had notes. Wearing the skin of a predator was often frowned upon by more pious factions. It smacked of paganism, of superstition, of people getting too comfortable with the idea that animal traits could be absorbed through osmosis. One bishop even called wolf-cloaked soldiers devotees of fur and foolishness. That bishop later recanted when one of those soldiers saved him from a collapsing tower, wearing the cloak. Tonight's historical fact. In medieval Europe, especially in colder and militarized regions, wolf pelts were not only worn for warmth, but served as powerful status symbols, awarded for acts of bravery, and used in ceremonial displays of fearlessness. Unusual footnote. One military unit in eastern France had a tradition where upon promotion, the soldier would have to sit through a full banquet, wearing only the wolf pelt and a belt. No trousers. The banquet was indoors, thankfully, but reputations were made and lost on drafty nights like those. And the academic question? Were these first ceremonies a form of cultural identity, reinforcing community and bravery through shared myth? Or were they theatrical excesses designed to keep restless young men from turning on each other? You watch the squire drape the cloak over his shoulders. His expression changes. Not dramatically, but enough. He stands straighter. He looks colder. He looks wilder. There's a reason costumes matter. Also, a word of caution. If you ever decide to wear faux fur to your next team meeting, and someone asks, why just say it's ceremonial? If they press, look them in the eye and whisper, "I earned this." And if someone gives you side-eye for wearing too many layers this winter, just howl. Quietly. With dignity. They'll either respect you or move seats. Win-win. Wolf as war strategy. You're crouched behind a stack of firewood trying not to sneeze. The ground beneath you is frozen. Your fingers are numb, and the sky above looks like it's holding back snow just out of spite. Across the field, torchlights flicker from an enemy camp, dozens of tents, soft voices, the occasional grunt from someone regretting dinner. And next to you, a cage. Inside it, 2 wolves, pacing, tense, quiet in that way animals get when something's about to happen. You've heard the rumors? You didn't believe them until tonight, because someone in your company, maybe your commander, maybe the guy with too much free time and access to ropes, has decided to weaponize wolves. Welcome to one of the stranger battlefield ideas of the Middle Ages chaos by canine. No, it wasn't common. And no, it wasn't especially effective. But in the more desperate, or inventive corners of medieval warfare, stories persist of commanders using wolves, sometimes tamed, sometimes recently borrowed from the wild, as psychological tools on the battlefield. The idea was simple in theory. You unleash wolves into an enemy camp at night. Panic ensues. Horses rear. Soldiers scream, tents collapse. Confusion buys you time. Time lets you flank. Flanking wins battles. Or so the logic went. One of the most colorful examples, though not entirely confirmed, comes from a 14th century skirmish in the Carpathians. The story goes that a small, outnumbered force, facing a mercenary army, released a pack of half-starved wolves they'd been feeding scraps for a week. The animals charged the enemy lines under cover of fog. Chaos broke out. Horses bolted. A fire started. A chicken coop exploded. Still unclear how that got there. The defenders attacked through the smoke and confusion, and miraculously they won. Historians remain divided. Some say it was pure invention, propaganda, dressed in fur. Others argue that small-scale use of animals, especially trained ones, could have had localized effects in nighttime ambushes or when raiding supply lines. Then there's the psychological angle. Even the threat of wolves was enough to rattle soldiers, especially those from urban areas who'd never encountered one outside of a song. There are reports of commanders tying wolf pelts to scarecrows, placing them near enemy lookouts. In the dark, a fluttering pelt and a well-timed howl could convince tired guards they were being watched. In one particularly theatrical case, a lord in Eastern Europe is said to have trained his hunting hounds to mimic wolf howls. He used them to stage nightly sound attacks on a besieged castle. No lives were lost, but several knights reportedly requested early retirement. Tonight's historical fact: though rare wolves were occasionally used both literally and symbolically in battlefield strategy during medieval times, their presence was less about direct violence and more about confusion, fear, and psychological disruption. Curious side detail: one general tried to paint wolves with glowing symbols before release to give them an otherworldly appearance. It didn't go well. The wolves licked the paint, got sick, and bit 3 men. The battle was delayed. The strategy was never repeated. And your scholarly debate of the evening: were these wolf-based tactics genuine military strategies or elaborate campfire stories designed to enhance the mystique of certain leaders? Were these wild animals part of the plan or the excuse the wolves in your cage shift? One locks eyes with you. Not angry, not scared, just alert. And you wonder, not for the first time, whether it's the humans who are out of their depth here. Also, if you ever face a challenge so overwhelming, you consider throwing an entire metaphorical wolf at it. Pause. Reflect. Maybe try snacks first. And if your team meeting needs a little edge, bring a strategy chart with a wolf doodle in the corner. Label it Plan C. Let them wonder. Saint and the Starving Wolf. You're standing in the edge of a frostbitten village where the houses lean together like they're sharing body heat and secrets. The fields are bare. The well creaks in the wind, and the snow is the kind that doesn't sparkle, it just sulks. There's not much food, not much hope, and absolutely no reason for what you're seeing now. A saint and a wolf sharing bread. This isn't a parable. It's a story passed down from villagers who swore it happened just like this, quiet, cold, and entirely unbelievable. In the winter of 1281, in a small village outside Bologna, Italy, there was said to be a feral wolf that had been raiding livestock. Not just sheep and goats, but root vegetables, turnips, onions, anything vaguely edible. The villagers were terrified, not just because of the damage, but because the wolf wasn't acting like a wolf. It came during the day. It watched people. It never ran when shouted at. It waited. The locals did what people usually do when faced with a problem they can't explain. They sent for a holy man. Enter Brother Lucian, a monk with a thin face, thinner sandals, and a reputation for talking to birds. The kind of saint who preferred mushrooms to gold and who once blessed an entire orchard because the apples looked nervous. He arrived, listened to the complaints, and without flinching, asked for a loaf of bread and a spot by the woods. That night, he sat by a bare tree and waited. The wolf came. Not fast, not snarling, just hungry. Lucian broke the bread, offered half, and according to witnesses, the wolf took it, gently sat, and stayed with him until sunrise. The story spread, of course. Some said the wolf was a test. Others claimed it was an angel in disguise. One farmer insisted it was just a very cold dog with good posture. But what mattered was this: after that night, the wolf stopped raiding the village. It stayed near the outskirts. Lucian would bring it scraps. In return, the wolf would bark whenever travelers approached, long before they reached the village road. A few months later, when the wolf died peacefully under Lucian's hut, the villagers buried it beside the chapel. The grave marker read simply, "He was hungry, and we fed him." There are dozens of similar stories scattered through medieval hagiographies. St. Francis of Assisi famously preached to wolves. St. Eilby of Emly was supposedly raised by one. St. Edmund of East Anglia had a wolf guard his severed head after martyrdom. Bit of a weird flex, but okay. These tales weren't just about kindness to animals. They were about the possibility of peace between the human and the wild. They asked what happens when, instead of hunting fear, we feed it. When we listen instead of lashing out. Tonight's historical fact: medieval hagiographies often featured saints forming bonds with animals, especially wolves, as symbolic representations of taming chaos through compassion and faith. Quirky twist: one 13th century monastery kept a page in their records titled Offerings to the Wolf. It listed leftovers, bones, crusts, and once a failed meat pie. The handwriting on that entry was unusually defensive. And the debate were these stories, literal, metaphorical, or somewhere delightfully in between. Did saints truly calm wolves? Or did communities project their yearning for safety onto whatever kindness they could imagine? You stand now, still watching the place where man and beast shared a meal under a silent sky. The snow hasn't stopped falling, but somehow the cold feels softer. Also, if you're ever overwhelmed by something that growls at your peace, try feeding it. Metaphorically, of course. Real wolves require licenses, and if someone tells you they're too wild to be helped, just remind them even a starving wolf can sit beside a monk if the bread is warm and the silence is kind. The Forbidden Howl. You're in a village where the roofs are low, the fences are high, and the rules are oddly specific. One of them pinned to the church door, etched into the wood like a confession, is simple. No howling after sundown. No exceptions. No explanations. Just a law that hums with the kind of tension usually reserved for curses and seasonal taxes. You're told it wasn't always this way. Once years ago, the village was known for its singing. Not the kind you'd hear in court or chapel, but something stranger. Every full moon, groups of villagers, mostly young men, though sometimes the brave or bored from other age brackets, would gather on the hillside and howl. Not shout, not cheer. Howl. It wasn't random. It wasn't wild. It was organized, rhythmic, even choreographed at times. They called it calling the wild in, and depending on who you asked, it was either tradition rebellion or courtship, with extra acoustics. It started small, they say. Just one person, maybe two. A response to a real wolf's call in the distance. A joke at first. But over the years it grew. New participants, harmonies, chants. There was even a kind of hierarchy, lead howler echo keeper, and one poor soul known as the sore throat sacrificer. People claimed it kept the wolves away, that by mimicking their sound, the village showed respect or confusion. Either way, it worked. Livestock stopped vanishing, and nearby forests grew quieter. But not everyone liked it. The local reeve, half bureaucrat, half buzzkill, called it a disturbance of moral tone. The priest worried it bordered on pagan ritual. One particularly uptight miller said it gave his grain nightmares. Eventually, after one especially loud evening, where a visiting noble reportedly dropped his goblet in fright, a new law was carved into being. No howling. At first, the howlers pushed back. Whispered calls in alleyways, secret hilltop gatherings, but crackdowns followed. Fines, forced silence, confiscated cloaks. A man was once arrested for excessive throat clearing. The joy left. The ritual died. Or did it old-timers claim that if you listen on a windless night, you can still hear it, the low call of someone remembering? A howl not for wolves, but for the echo of something free. Tonight's historical fact. In certain medieval villages, animal mimicry, especially howling, was practiced as part of seasonal rituals or communal bonding. These acts were sometimes tolerated, sometimes banned, depending on local leadership and the perceived risk of spiritual confusion. Unusual side note. A 14th century Bavarian village had a competition called Moon's Choir, judged by elders on volume pitch and duration. The winner received a smoked ham and the unofficial title of Alpha, which apparently involved zero actual responsibility, and the scholarly debate. Were these howling rituals vestiges of pre-Christian nature, rites, or emergent folk traditions meant to reclaim agency in a world filled with things beyond control? Did they echo real wolf behavior, or simply reflect a longing for connection power and sound in a silenced world? You stand at the edge of the village now. The forest is close. The moon is high. You hum a low note. Just a breath. Just a sound. And in the distance far off, not a reply, but something that lets you know the silence isn't complete. Also, if you've ever wanted to scream into the night, but settled for humming into your pillow, historically speaking, you're part of a well-documented human coping mechanism. And if your neighbors ever judge you for vocalizing at odd hours, just tell them you're honoring ancient tradition. Then ask if they'd like to join the Moon Choir. Watch what happens. Wolf dances and courtship games. You're standing in the middle of a village square that's halfway between a celebration and a chore. Ribbons hang from beams, musicians squabble over tempo, and someone's uncle is trying to cook something that smells like both turnips and ambition. But it's what happens after the sun sets that brings the real strangeness. Because tonight is the wolf dance. This isn't a masquerade, though there are masks. It's not a wedding, though there will be pairing off. It's something in between a medieval courtship ritual, dressed up in fur and folklore. And you're about to see it in action. In several parts of medieval Europe, especially in forested northern regions, folk traditions developed where eligible young villagers would participate in dances themed after wolves. The idea was simple: chase match test and twirl. The execution, slightly chaotic. The rules varied, but the setup was consistent. Young men, and in some cases women, wore crude wolf masks made from straw hide or carved wood and prowled the edges of the square. Their task, to select a partner by imitation. A low growl, a careful stalk, a sudden lunge, followed by a polite invitation to dance. Courtship, it turns out, could be deeply weird. Their chosen partner could accept or reject the proposal by responding in kind, either mimicking the wolf's pose or simply bopping them on the nose with a stick. The stick was symbolic, usually, occasionally painful. The rest of the dance played out like a pantomime of the hunt, one leading one, dodging both, eventually moving in a circular motion while the village cheered or pretended not to watch too closely. By the end, partners were matched up for the next feast walk, or if the village was feeling spicy night of shared stories by firelight. Medieval matchmaking didn't waste time. But why wolves? Because wolves in folklore were both feared and respected. They were clever, persistent, loyal to a mate. And when not actively hunting, they were surprisingly graceful traits that villagers hoped to see mirrored in whoever was going to help them survive winter and possibly raise 8 children in a one-room hut. One written account from 1427 describes a festival in southern Bohemia where a couple who performed the most convincing wolf courtship received a blessing from the local priest and a smoked fish wrapped in wool. Romance apparently smells like trout and damp linen. Not everyone approved, of course. Some clerics denounced the dances as unholy mimicry and accused participants of inviting bestial spirits into their homes. Others just disapproved of the music, which often included excessive drumming and the occasional lute solo that lasted far too long. Still, the dances persisted for centuries, in some places morphing over time into tamer games, symbolic rituals, and eventually, like everything, into folklore, half remembered by grandparents who grin and say, "We howled better in our day." Tonight's historical fact: wolf-themed courtship rituals were a documented part of some medieval, seasonal festivals, particularly in agrarian communities where animal traits were celebrated as both symbolic and practical virtues. Quirky detail of the night. In one village, record a dispute broke out when 2 men howled at the same woman simultaneously. She accepted neither, declaring, "Too much barking, not enough spine." The phrase was later adopted into a local proverb used for underwhelming suitors. And your scholarly debate: were these rituals playful folklore or remnants of pre-Christian animal worship? Did villagers genuinely see romantic potential in animal behavior, or were they simply making the best of cold nights, local legends, and an overabundance of masks? The music swells now. A young dancer lunges forward, howling softly. Their partner responds with a step, a grin, a spin. And just like that, the square becomes a blur of movement, fur laughter, and a kind of joy that doesn't care how silly it looks under torchlight. Also, if your dating life feels like a series of clumsy lunges and half-understood signals, congratulations. You're dancing in a long tradition. Just add a mask and some light choreography and call it heritage. And if someone ever asks why you still believe in strange seasonal love, smile and say, because sometimes it howls back. The Wolf Watchers Guild. You're in a wooden tower that leans slightly to the left, whether from time weather or a particularly long winter feast no one talks about anymore. A creaky ladder leads you up past dusty banners, mismatched boots, and a heavy logbook bound in wolf hide. The air is thick with the scent of oil lamps, smoked meat, and the unmistakable aroma of people who take their hobbies very seriously. Welcome to the Wolf Watchers Guild. It sounds made up. It should be. But in a few pockets of medieval Europe, particularly in the borderlands between forests and farms, there existed real organized groups of individuals who dedicated themselves to studying tracking and occasionally just admiring wolves, not hunting, not exterminating, observing. This wasn't some official arm of the crown or church. These were villagers, foresters, scribes, sometimes monks who believed that wolves deserved more than fear or folklore. They wanted to understand their patterns, their behavior, their logic, which is ambitious considering most people at the time couldn't reliably understand why chickens occasionally ran toward the well. The guilds were informal, secretive, and depending on who you asked, either deeply noble or completely unhinged. Members of one such group in the Black Forest called themselves Die Schattenlauscher, the Shadow Listeners. Their meetings were held at night in abandoned mills or ruined towers where they compared notes by firelight. Each watcher kept a field journal recording everything from paw prints to the emotional tone of the howls, which is either beautifully poetic or slightly sleep-deprived. They tracked migration routes, observed in behavior, and even had a code of non-interference: look, note, never chase. One entry from 1323 simply reads, "Observed pack of 6. One limps. One watches me. I did not blink. Neither did it. Mutual respect achieved." Of course, this sort of thing wasn't always welcomed by the wider village. Wolf watchers were sometimes accused of being too close to the beasts, spiritually, intellectually, and in one suspicious case, romantically. One poor fellow named Alain was nearly exiled after someone saw him dancing near a wolf den. Turns out, he just had a fondness for early morning calisthenics. The rumor lasted longer than he did. To protect themselves, guild members developed symbols: a notch in the left boot, a slashed ring carved into walking sticks, and a curious whistle pattern used to signal not a threat, just here to stare quietly. Whether the wolves understood this system remains unknown, but the squirrels were reportedly terrified. And then there were the stories. One manuscript describes a watcher who followed a lone wolf through 5 villages over 3 months. He claimed the animal led him away from danger 3 separate times, once from bandits, once from a flood, and once from a particularly bad tavern brawl. He dedicated his field journal to the quiet guide who walks with shadows. It was never published, but someone did turn it into a very dramatic stage play involving hand puppets. Tonight's historical fact: while not widespread, there were real individuals and small groups in medieval Europe who practiced early forms of wildlife observation, particularly of wolves, motivated by reverence, curiosity, and a desire to coexist rather than conquer. Quirky detail of the evening: one guild allegedly held an annual banquet where no meat was served, just root stew and cheese in honor of our furred neighbors. The only entertainment: dramatic readings of wolf encounters. One member was reportedly banned for embellishing too much and including dialogue. And the academic question: were these guilds precursors to natural science, or were they spiritual sects draped in the language of observation? Was this curiosity or a carefully controlled obsession? Outside the tower, the wind carries a sound you can't quite place. Not a voice, not a threat, just a presence. You jot it down in the logbook. Midnight, westward breeze, single howl. Peaceful. Also, if your hobby has ever been described as unusual or slightly concerning, just smile. You're walking in the well-worn boots of medieval wolf watchers who believed that not everything wild needs to be tamed. Some things just need to be seen. And if someone ever catches you staring too long into the woods, say you're listening for history. Then make a soft whistle. You never know who might be listening back. Wolves at the monastery gates. You're standing just inside the stone archway of a monastery that smells like patience. Rosemary and bread that's probably more holy than fresh. The sun has long set, but the courtyard glows gently with torchlight, casting flickers across the cobblestones and the soft folds of monks' robes moving like shadows. Then at the edge of the quiet, a low growl. Not angry, not warning, just present. And beyond the gates, there they are. Not one, not two, but a pack. 5 wolves. Not charging, not circling, just watching. For the brothers of St. Caedmon's Monastery, this was the 3rd night in a row, and by now they'd stopped pretending to be surprised. The wolves had become part of evening prayer, an audience just beyond the reach of candles, listening with tilted heads and unblinking eyes. Strange, yes, but not unheard of. In certain regions of medieval Europe, particularly during harsh winters or times of famine, wolves were drawn to the warmth and smell of monastic kitchens. What began as desperation sometimes turned into something else routine. Familiarity. A quiet truce. Monks, after all, were creatures of order and ritual. So were wolves in their own way. And when 2 routines overlap often enough, you start to recognize one another. At St. Caedmon's, the first sighting came during a storm. The kitchen had left its waste bins open scraps of barley porridge fish bones, a single disastrous attempt at baked apples. By morning, everything edible was gone. Neatly. No mess. Just paw prints in the slush, and a piece of chewed sandal, which Brother Aldrich insisted had already been damaged. The next night, the monks left a small offering intentionally. Bread crusts, wilted greens, a slice of cheese that had outlived its enthusiasm. The wolves returned. Again and again. Eventually, they were expected, counted, greeted in low voices through the grates. One monk even claimed he recognized them individually, the limper, the watchful one, the runt with crooked ears. He wrote in his diary, "They observe us with neither fear nor hunger now. Merely interest." Of course, not everyone approved. A visiting bishop once witnessed the wolves and declared it borderline heretical. The monks nodded politely and made no changes whatsoever. Another guest tried throwing a stone. The wolves did not flinch. The guest was not invited back. By spring, the wolves had stopped coming. The snow melted. The scraps were fewer. Life resumed. But the monks kept setting food by the gate anyway. Just in case. Tonight's historical fact. There are recorded accounts from medieval monasteries describing repeated peaceful interactions with local wolf packs, often during winters, where mutual observation evolved into tentative coexistence. Odd but lovely side note. A 15th century Flemish monastery documented a guest book of sorts, where monks marked down sightings of the wolves like honored visitors. One brother gave them all names from psalms. Another just called them the evening congregation. And the academic puzzle. Were these wolves genuinely responding to kindness, or simply smart enough to recognize a safe food source? Did the monks see them as beasts, symbols, or fellow souls navigating the cold? The torchlight flickers again. A shadow moves. Just one this time. A single wolf lingering at the edge of the gate. You watch it breathe, slow, steady steam curling from its muzzle into the chill. Then with a blink, it turns and vanishes into the night. You could call it nature, or reverence, or a very punctual dinner guest. Also, if your neighbor ever complains about wildlife near your home, just smile and say you're reviving a medieval tradition of ecological diplomacy. Bonus points if you offer the raccoons a slice of turnip. And if someone asks why you keep staring out the window after dusk, tell them you're waiting for someone who never knocked but always knew the way to the gate. A cloak for the brave. You're in a small stone chapel, tucked inside the folds of a snow-covered valley, where the wind seems to pray louder than the people do. The air smells of beeswax, melting snow, and quiet resolve. Benches creak beneath bundled guests. Everyone's breath clouds the air in soft little ghosts. And at the front, near the altar, stands the groom, wrapped not in silk, not in velvet, but in a full-length wolf cloak, tail and all. Welcome to one of the more peculiar wedding traditions of a remote mountain community where marriage wasn't just about love, it was about courage. And if you wanted to prove yourself brave enough to wed, you wore the wolf, literally. The tradition, rare but documented in several alpine regions, held that before a man could marry, he had to present himself before the village wearing a wolf pelt. Not just any wolf either. One that he had tracked, faced, and outwitted himself. At least that's what the official story said. In practice, by the 15th century, it had become slightly more symbolic. The wolf might have been hunted by an uncle, or purchased in a quiet trade. But the cloak remained a required part of the wedding attire. It wasn't about the kill. It was about what the wolf represented: endurance, loyalty, the ability to survive in harsh conditions and return with something useful. Which, now that you think about it, is a decent metaphor for marriage in a thatched roof house with 5 goats and no privacy. Some ceremonies took it even further. In one Carpathian village, the bride was expected to test the groom before the exchange of vows, not with words, but with a stare. If he flinched, he had to wear the pelt backwards for the feast. A mild humiliation, but memorable, and likely very warm around the knees. The wolf cloak was passed down generation to generation, heirlooms of fur and story. Over time, some became patchworks, multiple wolves stitched into one garment representing years of resilience, family, and creative tailoring. One preserved cloak, now housed in a museum, has embroidered symbols stitched beneath the fir star's teeth trees and the initials of every person who wore it at their wedding. Like a quilt of vows, each one sealed with a howl and a promise. The tradition eventually faded, as most do pushed out by linen suits and skeptical bishops. But echoes remain in songs, in whispered jokes, at bachelor feasts, in the way some men still tie a scrap of fur into their belt on wedding day, just for luck. Tonight's historical fact. In a handful of medieval European regions, wolf cloaks were used in ceremonial rites of passage, including marriage, symbolizing strength, protection, and readiness for the trials of shared life. Delightfully odd footnote. One wedding guest account describes a wolf-cloaked groom tripping during the feast and accidentally dragging half the roasted boar off the table. He stood up, declared, "The wolf is still hunting," and received a standing ovation. In the academic debate, were these cloaks symbols of masculine courage, community tradition, or thinly veiled fertility rites, dressed in socially acceptable fur? Were they about love or survival marketing? The bride now steps forward, her own cloak embroidered with tiny paw prints. She reaches up, touches the edge of the pelt resting on his shoulders, and smiles. He does not flinch. The guests exhale. The snow taps lightly against the stained glass windows. And somewhere far off in the forest, something howls. Also, if your wedding ever feels too traditional, just suggest a wolf-themed dress code. It worked for centuries. Worst case, someone trips over a tale and creates a new family legend. And if you're ever asked, what makes someone ready for commitment, smile and say the courage to face winter and wear fur with confidence. From wild to worshipped, you're at the edge of a forest trail just after dawn, when the fog is lifting like a curtain that knows how to exit dramatically. The ground is still damp from the night, the moss soft underfoot, and ahead just barely visible in the early light is a carving, not in stone, in a tree. It's old, weather-worn, a wolf's head mouth open in mid-howl eyes, narrowed as if seeing through time, or at least through several layers of superstition and bark. You've stumbled across one of the last markers of an ancient belief, a wolf, not as menace or nuisance, but as something close to sacred. Because while wolves had their place in fear, folklore, and fairy tale in some corners of the medieval mind, they rose even higher. They were honored, protected, whispered to. Not gods, no that would raise ecclesiastical eyebrows, but guardians, guides, ghosts in fur, treading between worlds. In certain remote highland communities, wolves were believed to be watchers of boundaries between village and wildlife, and deathman and memory. To see one at dusk was a warning. To see one at dawn, a blessing. Some travelers carried tokens carved from wolf bone not for luck, but for clarity. A belief that the wolf, sharp-eyed and unswayed by nonsense, saw things as they were, and in seeing them might lend you a bit of that wisdom, or at least keep you from wandering into a swamp. And then there were the burial practices. Archaeologists have found graves from the 10th to 13th centuries where wolf bones carefully placed, often just a paw or skull, were buried alongside humans. Not trophies, not pets, companions. One grave in northern Hungary belonging to a woman believed to be a healer contained her tools, her herbs, and the paw of a wolf resting across her chest. It had been wrapped in linen. The line between reverence and fear blurred further with time. A few monastic texts refer to wolves as God's silent sentinels, while others label them harbingers of divine judgment. Either way, they were never ignored. One anonymous 14th century poem scratched into the wall of a watchtower reads, "The lion preaches, the dove forgives, but the wolf remembers, and the forest lives." That's about as close to fan poetry as medieval Europe got. By the late Middle Ages, many of these beliefs had faded or been folded into folklore. Wolves became metaphors, their real cries lost beneath the louder voices of empire agriculture and bureaucracy. But in those places where the forest still whispered louder than the church bells, the stories lingered. Carvings were left, songs survived. And on particularly cold nights, old families lit candles at their windows, not to ward off wolves, but to welcome them, to say we haven't forgotten. Tonight's final historical fact. Beyond fear and folklore, wolves occupied a unique space in medieval imagination, as creatures of balance bridging the gap between wildness and wisdom, shadow and sanctuary. Strangest detail to end with a monastery chronicle from Wales describes a single candle always left burning in the western tower window during winter months so the wolves would know we remember the pact. No one wrote what that pact was. And the scholarly conversation, was this reverence a remnant of animistic belief, a response to isolation and awe, or simply the human need to find reflection in things untamed? Were wolves ever truly worshipped, or were they just respected in a way? Modern noise no longer makes room, for the fog continues to lift. The carving remains still, its lines faint, but persistent. You place a hand on the tree, just for a moment. The bark is rough. The silence around you is not empty, only waiting. Also, if you've ever felt out of place, a little too wild, or simply a bit quieter than the world demands, consider this. In another time, they might have carved your face into a tree, with respect. And if you ever feel lost, try listening for the softest sounds, the low ones, the in-between ones. History suggests you'll find a wolf there, not to chase, not to fear, just to follow. And now the fire is low. The trail has ended. The forest is quiet not because it's empty, but because it knows you're resting. You've walked beside wolves tonight. Not the snarling villains from bedtime fears, but the real ones, cautious, clever, and often misunderstood. You've seen how they became more than animals, how they slipped into banners, prayers, masks, and marriage cloaks, how they were loved, feared, mimicked, and remembered. You've wandered through valleys where howling was a kind of poetry. You've peeked into monasteries that lit candles, not just for saints, but for the silver eyes beyond the wall. And you've met people, real peculiar people, who carved wolves not as warnings, but as mirrors. The truth is, we've always looked to the wild to explain ourselves. And the wolf? It's everything we're not supposed to be: restless, instinctive, fiercely loyal to those who matter, and unbothered by those who don't. They survive. They remember. They vanish without apologizing. And tonight, you've traveled with them, quietly, gently, without needing to run. So now, wherever you are curled in blankets, drifting near sleep, still holding on to the echo of a distant howl, let your breath slow. Let the cold forest fade. Let the candles go out one by one until only the soft silence remains. You're safe. That's the story for tonight. May your dreams be filled with wonder and peace.